preaching this summer so far through a series called Breathing Room, looking at finding out what a life with a little space looks like. Could you use a little breathing room this summer, everyone? We think that summer maybe is a time to hit the pause button a little bit, a time for routines to shift, if not ever so slightly, for you to reorganize your priorities. And so this series is designed to do just that. Well, I was out last week. Rachel and I took a trip for our 10th wedding anniversary. Our in-laws, Rachel's parents, graciously agreed to keep our children, and they told us how many nights they were willing to do that. And we said, okay, that's how many nights we'll go on our vacation. Where can we go? Which was really great. And so we chose the spot in the continental United States that was the furthest away we could possibly get from our children. Now, that's what we've been telling people, because we went to Washington State, and people go, why did you go to Washington State? And I think, well, because it's the furthest away in the continental U.S. that we could get from our children. But the truth is that we have always just been fascinated with the national parks up in that area and the West Coast, and great seafood and beautiful scenery, and we thought, why don't we go and spend a few days there and check it out? And so we spent a couple of nights in Olympic National Park on the peninsula of Washington. It was beautiful. And then a couple of nights in Seattle. And we started off our trip with something very weird. We're weird travelers when we go into cities. We like to do tours the first day we're there just to kind of hear the history. And we like to find interesting ways to do that. So ghost tours always have great stories. But we found something very odd in Washington, something called an underground tour. Underground tour. Anybody done the underground tour in Washington, Seattle? It's pretty cool, actually, because the city isn't built on ground level like many of our cities. It's built up quite a bit, and there's a real reason for that. And I want to share this story because it's so compelling. So back in the 1800s, when Seattle was being settled, everything was on the ground level. And the timber industry and the fishing industry were kind of the two major economic engines at the time. And folks would harvest logs, and then they would be shipped out by boat, so they needed to get them down to the water's edge somehow. So they would just drag them down the dirt streets of the city. They called that street Skid Row, where they got the logs from the upper lands down to the water to be taken to places like San Francisco to build. There's a high demand for timber down there. And so as you can imagine, Seattle, at least as far as our recorded history goes, has been rainy. And so rainy streets with logs drug across them mean craters, right? Mud holes. And when you're trying to get your wagon wheels down there, it doesn't make for a very great experience. And so there was a man named Henry Yesler. He owned a sawmill there, provided a bunch of jobs, actually, and helped get the city going. Henry devised this idea. He said, I've got all of this refuse from my sawmill that I need to get rid of, and the city has a pothole problem. And so I'll just graciously volunteer to dump my sawdust in the potholes caused by the logs and the wagon wheels, and I'll be a great citizen. And so he did. And later they made him mayor because they were so grateful, which is a whole other story. Well, so this went on for quite a while until one day, a man at a glue factory was not paying attention, and his vat of glue overflowed onto some wood chips and started a fire, which became known as the Great Seattle Fire, and it began to cover blocks and blocks. Now, they call it great for a particular reason. One, it got rid of their sawdust streets, which was a plus, although in a fire, you don't want sawdust in your streets because that just kind of fuels the spread of the fire. But the second reason is because, and there's a picture of the fire, the streets were moist, but they weren't just moist from rainwater. There were two other reasons that they were wet at the time, and forgive me for going here. It's Father's Day, at least, so we can have a little fun. The first is Puget Sound. You build on kind of the ground level in a wet city. Well, they didn't take into account in the beginning the high tide. As it came in, it would increase the moisture of the streets and contribute to the problem, hence more sawdust, right? But there was a second reason that the streets were moist. About the time, a few years before the Great Fire, Thomas Crapper over in England, no kidding, created this water closet. And they were beautiful, by the way, very ornamental. And it was quite the rage. They first came into America, I think, at the White House, and then everybody wanted them. And Seattle was no exception. And so everybody started installing water closets in their home, which necessitated a sewer system. Well, somebody saw fit to have the terminal end of the sewers dump out in Puget Sound. Think about that for a moment. Tide goes out, right? Streets are drier. Tide comes in, streets get wet. Sewage system is installed, dumps out into the Sound. Tides go out, sewage goes out. Tides come in, sewage washes back in on your sawdust streets. Didn't make Seattle a very clean, great-smelling place to live. That was one of the problems outside. Inside, it created a two-way river. Out, when the tides were low, rushing back in and becoming geysers inside of people's homes when the high tide came back in. It was a huge situation. It was a huge problem. And so Seattle calls their fire great because it burned everything within a 25-block radius, including their sewer system and sawdust streets, all the way to the ground, and they had the opportunity to start over again. And they called it great for many reasons. Word spread around the world about the tragedy, and so money became pouring in for their redevelopment, and they were able to re-envision the city from the ground up. Now, the man who started the fire, by the way, left town even while the fire was burning, never to be seen again. And nobody died in the Great Fire. That man probably would have if people had found him, but he was long gone by that point. And so they decided after this fire, okay, well, we don't want moist roads that people are dragging logs over, and we don't want sewage washing back up. We want to keep that under our homes, thank you very much, and we probably don't want to dump it in the Sound either. That's not a sound plan. Get it? Sorry, I had to go there. And so what we'll do is we're just going to build the city up. And so the city officials got with all the people. They had a town hall meeting and said, here's what we want you to do. We want you to rebuild, but we want you to build 2 or 3 stories. And know that we're working toward a plan where your second story will eventually be your first story, and then you will enter in on that level and you'll have a basement. But for now, your first story needs to be your first story. I know this is so confusing. And so they set to work building up these retaining walls, building up the city to raise the roads to the second story level of all of the houses and businesses. And they filled these walls, in between the walls, in with whatever they could get. Sawdust. I won't go into detail about everything they dumped in there, but pretty much anything that you could find that could fill in, about 8 to 35 feet tall, depending on where you were, they filled between the walls, and then they paved over it and made the roads. Well, that was fine and good, except it took them a while to get to the sidewalks. And so you had about an 8-foot gap between the high roads and the second story of these homes. So how do you get in when you've got a gap for about 3 years between the street and your entrance? Ladders. Ladders. So people literally went from business to business by climbing down ladders, going in and climbing up with shopping bags full of various things. It was crazy. So you can imagine life in early Seattle was not all that it was cracked up to be. Now you can tour the tunnels underground. The sidewalks have been finished now for a while. And you actually can see the first level, the 1800s level of the city before the second stories became the first stories. It's actually pretty cool. I'd recommend the tour if you ever are in Seattle. So why all this talk about the best made plans not always going as you expect them to go? I think as a culture, sometimes we think that chasing after a higher standard of living, which is what they were looking for in Seattle, will lead to a higher quality of life. And so we continually look for the next bigger and better, moving onward and upward, thinking that we are going to be happy one day if we just reach this milestone or that milestone. But we figure out every time we arrive at something, there's always the next level to get to, and so things aren't always as we planned. We've been looking through Breathing Room at what it looks like to overstuff our lives. We tend to live in culture today at a place where we're running at 120% of our capacity. We can't fit anything else in. Well, maybe you can. I could find a few places to fit some more stuff in here. But really, our lives are so full that when something out of the ordinary happens, we just don't have time. We're not making time for one another anymore. Our schedules are too full. We live on 120% of what we bring in because of debt. And so our finances don't have any wiggle room. Our relationships are ultimately what suffers because it's the people that we crowd out when we don't plan. And so what Breathing Room is all about this summer is learning to make space to breathe, to make space in your life, in your schedule, your finances, your relationships, to be with those that you love the most, so that you can experience happiness and a higher quality of life. And so my hope is that this summer you'll take some time to kind of reorder your priorities so that you can experience peace like you've never known before. So let's dig into this statement a little bit. A higher standard of living doesn't necessarily lead to a higher quality of life. Think about this. What is a standard of living? Standard of living is the stuff, the level that we attain and the stuff that we surround ourselves by. That's the best way that I can maybe characterize it. And so once you achieve a higher standard of living, you don't ever want to go backwards. You want to stay at where you are or move up. It's kind of the way that things work in our culture today. So you buy a bigger house, you might downsize in retirement, but your goal isn't to get a less nice house. You're going to get a house that's as nice even if you downsize the size of it. So that's what we're looking at today. Well, in American culture, we are chasing after a higher standard of living. And everything that we do is driven by, I think, this fallacy that if we get this raise, right, if we have more income, then we can have more stuff and we can achieve this dream and then we will be happy. But it doesn't always work that way. I want to share a statistic that's very startling here, or at least some information. You know, we tend to think that the middle class is shrinking. Have you heard that recently? The middle class is shrinking. And we assume that, well, middle class people are becoming lower class people, and, you know, you hear the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But in reality, that's not exactly the case. People are moving into the upper class. Among some of the population, there's more disposable income to spend on stuff, the things that you're hoping and dreaming for. And so some middle class people are becoming upper class people. In our own community, our median income today is about $96,000 a year. Average household median income. And so we're living this. We're seeing people kind of upwardly mobile and more affluent. It's not everybody, but it's some. 51% of those who live within a 5-mile radius of our church make $50,000 a year or more. And so that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about this stuff. We are upwardly mobile and we are becoming more affluent. Well, one of my favorite things to do with my family every day is to take a walk, and I do that as often as I can. And there's hardly a day that I walk around our little piece of our neighborhood and I don't see a truck outside of somebody's house, either making a porch addition or adding a pool or doing some kind of remodel. But my favorite time to take a walk is on Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, because that's recycle day, or as I like to call it, bare your personal life for all of your neighbors to see day. I don't know why in this community that we have bins for our trash that have lids that close, and we're expected to put our recycling loose in a little bitty bin where it blows all over the road and you can see everything that your neighbors have bought or consumed within the last week. It's crazy, but it's fun. So not that I'm looking. I know some of you, I look around and you're going, what did I put in recycling this last week? But it's awesome. You can look and say, wow, they partied hardy last weekend, right? Or you can look and go, hey, you know, they got a new flat panel television. Or, hey, they got the latest gadget at Bed Bath & Beyond. I mean, it is great. But as you walk around, you begin to see this whole higher quality of life, the things and the stuff that we're filling our lives with. And so we build bigger barns to hold more of our stuff. That's what I'm getting at. I know you're going to be more careful about what you put in your recycle bin next week. I'm watching you. I'm just kidding. Y'all are watching me too. But it's that reality, right? That we are affluent. We're looking for happiness by pursuing a higher quality of living. Well, this has been an issue from the earliest days in the church. And the Apostle Paul, when he's writing a young church planter he mentored named Timothy, really got at this. He wanted to teach new Christians, don't pursue the things that money can buy. Don't place all of your love as the love of money or the love of stuff. Have the love of God be first and foremost in your life and order everything else accordingly. And so this is what he says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain. Now pause there for just a moment. Godliness with contentment is great gain. You see, we think of great gain as the income, the money that we bring into our household. And that translates into more things that we think are going to make us happy. But do you see that C word that Paul uses to exhort Timothy, to encourage him? He says contentment. Godliness with contentment is great gain, not the amount of stuff that you amass. Let's continue on. For we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. This is the whole, you don't see a moving trailer behind a hearse kind of thing. Okay. Next slide. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Now think in terms of wealth, not just money that you're accumulating, but the stuff that you accumulate in your life and how you go about that. Where you're getting in debt to get something today that you're paying for over a period of time, that's all included here in this understanding. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. Let's hang there for a moment. Notice that a lot of people get this phrase backwards. They say, money is the root of all evil. And it comes from here. But it doesn't. That's a misquote of 1 Timothy 6:10, right? It's the love of money that's the root of all kinds of evil. It's the love of money placed over and above the love of Christ that leads to lots of woes. You see here, some people eager for money, for possessions, for stuff, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Next slide, please. Command those who are rich in this present world, and by the way, by definition, according to this passage, we're all rich. Right? Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Isn't that beautiful? Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that truly is life. This is God's word for us today. Thanks be to God. So you see, quality of life and standard of living are packed right into the middle of this passage. And what the quality of life that Paul is describing here to Timothy is eternal, everlasting life. It's the life that truly is life. And if that's not a memory verse, I don't know what is. Laying up for yourself eternal treasure, the treasure of relationship with God, with others that God has placed in your life. That's truly life. That's quality of life. That's what really brings fulfillment, not the stuff that we bring in to our own situations. Well, where are the challenges with standard of living? So this is nothing new, right? People have always struggled with getting more stuff, buying the bigger house, getting the next bigger car, going on vacations everywhere. And I want to stop and I want you to hear me say, and this passage says it too, these things aren't bad. Looking at enjoying the world that God has given us and the things that are made with what God has created, with the intellect that he's given us, that is God honoring. But we have to remember when it comes to our finances and the way that we budget and spend, God has a plan for that so that we don't feel stress. So we're not constantly worried as we keep up with our neighbors and keep up with the Joneses. We see their recycling out in the yard, or we see the truck that's building the back patio in somebody else's house, and you think, well, I'm falling behind. I need to get those things too. And that's when we're tempted to go and to use debt and credit to get today what we can't yet afford. And that's what pushes us to live according to 120% of what we bring in. We've got to live differently. We've got to live differently. Now think for just a moment about debt. Americans collectively carry about $716 billion worth of debt. The average percentage rate, this is just credit card debt, by the way, and the average percentage rate on credit cards is like 15.5%. So think about that for just a moment when you're looking at living over your level. It's preposterous, right? We need a different way. I think we're fueled by this myth that a higher standard of living leads to a higher quality of life. But those two things aren't directly proportional. I think they're inversely proportional. I think the more that we pursue a higher standard of living sometimes, the less quality of life we actually experience, because we don't leave breathing room for the stuff of life, for that medical emergency, or for that roof repair that needs to be done, or for whatever comes. And then we're forced to have to put that on credit, and then we're stifled, we're squashed. And that's not the way that God desires for us to live. God wants us to have breathing room and created us for that. And so how do we get at a higher quality of life? Well, it's prioritization, really. God has designed things in such a way that breathing room is built into the fabric of his people. And so it's really simple, and here you're going to think, oh great, here's the giving sermon. It's actually not. It's about financial breathing room. But I do want to talk about the tithe for just a moment, because God, in his design for the way that his people were supposed to live, said, you're not supposed to live on 100%, right? At least 10% is mine before you spend anything else. And this is present in the scriptures all the way from Genesis. Abraham tithed, Jacob tithed. We begin to see this in the law in Leviticus and Numbers, that God speaks through Moses, through the people, the first tenth of everything belongs to me. And when God established this idea of the tithe, he created the idea of financial margin, breathing room. There's a beautiful passage in Nehemiah that I want to share with you regarding the tithe, the giving of the first 10%, the first fruits of everything that we bring in. And what's so phenomenal about this passage is that it's being spoken, it's occurring after the exile, after the people of Israel failed to do the things that God commanded, and Babylon came and invaded them, destroyed their cities, and carried some of their residents off as prisoners of war to live for over a generation. Well, here the king gave Nehemiah some resources to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem and to rebuild the city, and some of the people heard the law read for the very first time, and so this is a response to that in Nehemiah 10 regarding giving and the tithe. Moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all of our trees, and of our new wine and olive oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. So people realized one of the ways that they were unfaithful to God that led to the downfall of their society was the failure to give God money off the top, the first of everything. Now, this is an agrarian society, so it wasn't just income. It was, if you have fields and you're harvesting grain, the first tenth goes to God. If you've got grapes and you're making wine, the first tenth goes to God. If you've got livestock that you're raising, the first 10, the one out of every 10, the best one, goes to God. And it was just part of the fabric, breathing room. I don't have to live on 100%. I can trust God. Something beautiful happens, though, when that part is tithed. All of a sudden, people who are aliens in the land, foreigners, widows, orphans, that's how they're cared for, out of that 10%. The religious life of the community, the temple, the religious leaders, they're supported out of that 10%. Old Testament all the way up through New Testament. That's the way ministry happened to serve the good of the people. And so you begin to think, okay, I'm worried that I can't, if I give to God, I might not have enough to take care of myself. Well, this is the first safety net. You're not alone. I know it feels like it takes a lot of humility to come and say, I need help, I had this happen. When 10% of what everybody makes off the top is there available for people who are falling into hardship, you don't have to worry. God will use that to take care of you. That's part of the breathing room that we get. God says, trust me. Trust me enough to give me this 10% off the top and see what happens. And so imagine if you were to do that in your own budget. If you created yourself some breathing room by giving the first 10% off the top. And see if you find enough to live on afterwards. This is such a powerful concept in God's mind that there are scriptures that talk about testing the Lord. Now, I know that you're thinking about the law and the commandments that say, do not put the Lord your God to the test. But when it comes to the idea of tithing, it's the only place in all of Scripture where God says, test me. Test me. I want to read this quote from Malachi because it's so compelling. Listen to this. God says, and before this, by the way, he's saying, you're cheating me by not bringing your tithe. And then here's what he says. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. Test me, he says. Trust me. You're not going to go without. And I hear story after story, and later this year we're gonna do a thing where we interview people who have experienced God's abundance and blessing in their lives when they've taken a risk in this area. And I've heard this year, story after story, where people have said, I was facing this hardship. I gave anyway. I gave sacrificially. I gave where it hurt, And then I received a check in the mail that was more than enough to cover what I was worried about. I mean, I've heard story after story after story this year, and I know I see some eyes rolling. I see some heads going back. Here's the preacher talking about money again. I do because I love you. I do because I want you to experience this breathing room and this peace in your life. This has nothing to do about funding the church. This has everything to do with you finding breathing room in your own life. Proverbs even speaks to this. Look at this. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all of your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. Once again, you trust God. Everything belongs to God. You trust God with what God has entrusted to you by giving back a tenth. God's going to make sure that you have more because you're a good steward of God's resources. It's just the way that God set it up. And that's where we find this fruitfulness in this breathing room. So some statistics. American Christians, on average, give 2.5% of their income. And so I wonder, and some give over and above, 20% or more, and some give 0.2%, and some give none. But this is an average across American Christians with studies that have been done over the last decade or so. But I wonder, how much different would society be if Christians tithed? There wouldn't be worry about anything. Some of these social problems that we're facing, gone. World hunger, gone. Access to water around the world, taken care of, right? We wouldn't have to worry. I'll just leave it there. Breathing room. God says, don't live off 120%. Don't live off of 100%. The first 10% is mine. But here's the second thing. Saving is important. And I know. Here it is. But it's very true. We've got to save because planning for the future, planning for that vacation, planning for that big purchase saves you so much money in the long run. And it helps you be better stewards of what belongs to God anyway. If you save before that big trip, then you don't have to worry about paying it off over the next 2 years when you get home. Plan 2 years in advance, have the whole family involved in it. And then when the trip comes, you're like, woohoo, this is awesome, right? You can really enjoy it because it's already paid for, right? It's a whole different way of thinking. Where that medical emergency comes, you've got money in the bank to cover it. Just think about how freeing that would be. And if you're there and you're thinking this is impossible, I'm going to give you some small steps to take here at the end as to how to take care of it. And so breathing room begins to come when we set aside some money next after the tithe for the future. And the Bible speaks of this from the very beginning about planning, about saving. Saving creates financial breathing room in our lives. There's so many scriptures about saving and investing in the scriptures, but I picked out a couple I want to share with you right now. Proverbs 13:7. One person pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. So the moral of this proverb is, live as if you have little, and that leads to much. Live as if you have much, and that leads to little. And so those who are rich, living like they're poor, are saving. The other proverb is Proverbs 21:20. The wise store up food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. Okay, so you've got the first 10% off the top goes to God. The second 10% goes to savings. And then the other 80 you have to live on. Now, I know you may be thinking, well, that's not enough. Maybe you're here today and you've said, I'm one of those people that contributing factor, that $765 billion of credit card debt, right? I've got that 15.5% interest rate or whatever. I don't know how I can even begin. How could 80% be enough? It just is. When it comes to saving, Dave Ramsey says a good place to start is to set a goal of $10,000. Other financial experts say set aside 2 months' salary to create that financial breathing room that you want to have. And then every time, we're going to get into this in just a little bit, you set aside more and more as your income goes up. Now, you may be saying, well, I can do that when I get that raise, and then it'll be good, right? No, because if you're not disciplined today to live on the 80%, when you get that raise, you're still going to live on the 100 or 120%. It's not going to change. We're talking about lifetime habits here. So God says, 10% off the top, trust me in this, and see if I won't pour out So much blessing that you won't even be able to handle it. And God teaches, plan for the future, plan for life, plan for the unknown, plan for what's coming up, and live on the other 80. That's still a lot, right? If you're not living off of everything that comes in or more than everything that comes in, you've got that space. You've got that breathing room. And so here's the moral of our story. A higher standard of living does not necessarily lead to a higher quality of life. A higher standard of living does not necessarily lead to a higher quality of life. But pursuing a higher quality of life leads to a higher standard of living. So I want to leave you with some ways to start. If you're sitting here going today, preacher, this is all good and I've heard it before. How do I start? It seems impossible. The first is every time you get a raise, increase saving and giving first, not in that order. But increase your giving, increase your saving to move toward this 10% and 10% goal. Second, consider what you can cut from your budget today. So how do you do that? Well, cable is expensive. Are you watching all 500 channels? Right? Could you be satisfied with 120 channels? I mean, there are ways to do that. Are you using everything you're paying for on your cell phone bill? There are ways to cut down without having to take on extra work. Third, pay off debt as quickly as you can. The high-interest debt first, followed by the low-interest debt. And Dave Ramsey would say, pay off your lower balances first and then compound your payment into your higher balances. He calls it the debt snowball, and you can look that up on Dave Ramsey's website to talk about that. And then the fourth and final thing is save for vacations and big purchases rather than relying on credit. Dave Ramsey would even say, if you can find a little bit of extra work here and there, do it, and put that money toward debt reduction on the front end so that you can experience the peace that follows in the end. Dear friends, my hope and prayer for all of us is that we can find breathing room in our financial lives, that we no longer live on 120% of what we bring in, but that we can take small steps today that lead over a period of time to living on the 80%, so that we can trust that even after we've given to God and we've saved for our future, that there's more than enough room to do everything we want. And that just makes good sense. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Let us pray. God, thank you for this message and for the truth that you have created us in a certain way to have breathing room. Lord, you are the source and giver of every good and perfect gift. Help us to trust that you will always provide for us, that we don't need to hoard away or scrimp away, Lord, that we don't need to buy something today that we haven't saved for. Help us to know that in you there is more than enough. And with what you've called us to set aside for your purpose and what you've called us to save, when the unexpected comes, Lord, you are going to take care of us. You will never leave us or forsake us. Lord, none of us here want to live on more than we bring in. We've just found ourselves in that way. And we stand here before you today saying, God, how do we get there? Well, help us to implement small steps, one step at a time. If we're giving 1% now, help us to do 2% next year. If we're doing 5%, help us to do 7%. Help us to find room in our budget. Help us to find a little bit of extra work to bring in more to pay off our debts, Lord, so that we can experience the breathing room that you have created us for and feel the weight of that stress on our marriages and on our relationships just melt away in you. God, as we gather on this Father's Day, we're mindful of the dads in our lives, those who are still here and those who have gone on to glory, who are alive in your presence today. We give you thanks for them, Lord. We pray for our fathers who are here, who are still pouring into our lives, God, that you would strengthen them, that you would alleviate their stresses, financial and otherwise, that you would fill them with your Spirit so that they can continue to raise generations that are hungry for you and chase after you. God, thank you for being our Father. Thank you for calling us here today. And thank you for helping us find freedom.